wind found the cracks in the stone before it found anything else, and that was how Ruth Callahan always knew winter had turned serious in the high country, long before the first flake ever touched the ground. She felt it first as a thin whistle through the seam above the hearth, a sound like a kettle that never came to a boil, and she had learned over 11 winters in that grotto to trust it more than any almanac. Smoke curled up from a chimney that seemed to grow straight out of bare granite, rising thin and steady against a sky the color of hammered iron. And any traveler who happened to glance up at that ridge from the frozen valley below might have rubbed his eyes and looked again, certain he was imagining a house where no house had any right to be. But it was there. It had always been there, tucked into the mouth of a grotto that the mountain itself seemed to have carved out and offered up, as though the rock had been waiting 100 years for two people foolish enough and patient enough to call it home. Stay with this one, because what happened during the 7 days that followed was not the kind of thing either Walter or Ruth Callahan ever expected to live through, and it changed more than just the two of them. Walter Callahan was 71 years old that autumn, a big-boned man gone soft in the shoulders but still strong through the forearms, with a beard the color of old snow and eyes that had gone a little cloudy, but missed very little all the same. Ruth was 68, small and quick, her hands roughened by 40 years of needlework and gardening and hauling water, her hair pinned back under a faded bonnet she had owned longer than some towns had existed. They had no children. There had been a boy once, decades back, who had lived 8 days and then hadn't. And after that there had simply been the two of them, and later a dog. The dog was a golden retriever they called Sonny, a name Ruth had chosen because the dog's coat reminded her of harvest wheat catching the last light of an October afternoon, and because after the boy she had wanted something in the house that answered to a hopeful word. Sonny was getting on in years himself now, his muzzle gone pale, his gait a little stiff in the mornings, but his nose was as sharp as ever, and his loyalty sharper still. The three of them lived together in the grotto on the mountain above a town called Miller's Crossing, a scattering of clapboard buildings and one dusty main street some 4 miles down and west, where the Callahans went perhaps twice a month for flour, salt, needles, and news. The grotto had not always been their home. For 30 years, Walter and Ruth had worked a modest spread down in the valley proper, raising a little stock and a garden that Ruth tended like scripture, until a spring flood had taken the cabin roof and half the barn, and the debts that followed had taken the rest. They had been too proud to ask the town for charity and too poor to rebuild in the usual way, and it was Walter, standing on the ridge one gray afternoon surveying what was left of their lives, who noticed the wide, dry mouth of stone above the tree line, sheltered from the worst of the wind by an overhang that jutted like a brow above a patient eye. His own father, a stonemason back in Missouri before the war, used to say that a mountain will always tell you where it wants to be lived in, if you are willing to listen instead of insisting. Walter had spent that whole autumn remembering his father's hands on cold granite, the old man's voice explaining how stone breathes differently than wood, how it holds warmth long after a fire dies and holds cold long after summer comes, and how a man who understands that difference need never fear the weather again.
So they had built into the grotto rather than against it, using what timber they could salvage and what stone the mountain offered freely, and slowly, over 2 hard years, they had made themselves a home unlike any other in that county. It had a proper chimney, cut through solid rock by patient chiseling, and no small amount of Walter's father's remembered wisdom. It had 2 small windows facing east to catch the morning sun, and a door of thick oak that Walter had hung himself, and inside walls of stone that stayed cool in summer and held the fire's heat through the longest winter nights. The town had thought them mad at first. Some still did. But the Callahans had lived through 3 winters already that would have broken a lesser shelter, and each spring they came down the mountain a little thinner, a little more weathered, and entirely alive. And slowly the talk in Miller's Crossing had shifted from pity to something closer to respect, though a stubborn thread of suspicion remained, because folks in that country did not easily trust what they could not fully explain. That particular autumn, the one that led into the 7 days, had begun ordinarily enough. Ruth had put up preserves from a garden she kept in narrow terraces cut into the slope below the grotto. Jars of chokecherry and wild plum lined along the stone shelves like soldiers standing watch. Walter had gone into the high timber twice a week with Sonny at his heel, cutting and hauling wood, stacking it in the deep dry recess at the back of the grotto, where the mountain itself kept it from rot and damp. They counted their stores the way other people might count blessings, out loud at the end of each day, a small ritual Ruth had started years back and never let go. 41 jars of preserves, 6 sacks of dried beans, 210 days of cut wood, by Walter's careful reckoning, though he always added a few days in reserve, because his father used to say, "A man who counts exactly right has already made his first mistake." It was during one of these wood-gathering trips, in the last gold week of October, that Sonny had gone still in a way that made Walter stop and take notice. The old dog had planted his feet at the base of a rock face none of them had ever paid much mind to, ears up, nose working, and would not be called away no matter how Walter whistled. When Walter went to see what had captured the dog's attention so completely, he found a narrow seam in the stone, hardly wider than a man's shoulders, breathing out warm, faintly sulphurous air, even as frost lay thick on the ground all around it. He stood there a long while with his hand pressed flat against the rock, feeling heat rise up through his palm from somewhere deep inside the mountain, and he thought, unbidden, of his father's voice again, telling him that stone holds secrets the way a good friend holds a confidence, quietly, and only for those patient enough to ask properly. He did not rush the discovery. That was not his way, and it was certainly not Ruth's. Over the following weeks, whenever the weather allowed, Walter returned to the seam with a lantern and a coil of rope, widening the opening by careful degrees, never taking more stone than the mountain seemed willing to give. What he found, several yards in, was a low chamber warmed by some deep vent of the earth's own heat, dry as a kept promise, large enough to store food and even to shelter animals in the worst of weather. He told Ruth about it over supper one evening, describing it the way another man might describe finding money, though the two of them had learned not to think in those terms anymore. Ruth listened with her hands still in her lap, and then she said only, Your father would have called that mountain a good neighbor." And Walter had nodded, because that was exactly the thought sitting in his own chest, unspoken until she gave it words. They began moving supplies into the warm chamber through the last weeks of autumn, quietly, without announcing the discovery to anyone in town, partly out of old habit, and partly, though neither said it aloud, because they had learned that anything of value in that country eventually drew attention they did not want. The attention came anyway, as it tended to in Miller's Crossing. A man named Everett Bennett ran most of what could be called commerce in that town, owning the mercantile outright and holding paper on half the ranches within 20 miles. A soft-spoken man with silver hair and silver watch chains, who never raised his voice because he never needed to. Bennett had wanted the mountain land above the Callahans' old homestead for years, not for the thin soil or sparse grazing, but because a survey crew passing through some seasons back had let slip, in the careless way surveyors sometimes did over a shared bottle, that the ridge sat above rich mineral seams that a proper mining concern would pay handsomely to develop. Bennett had said nothing of this to the Callahans, offering instead, through his son, a low-ball sum for the grotto and the acres around it, framed as a kindness to two old folks who surely tired of mountain living. Ruth had listened to young Daniel Bennett deliver his father's offer on the porch of the mercantile one gray November morning, her basket of goods balanced on her hip, and she had simply said, "Tell your father we are quite comfortable where we are," in a voice pleasant enough that Daniel could not quite tell whether he had been refused or merely delayed, and he rode back up to his father's ranch with the uneasy feeling that he had somehow lost a negotiation without ever having a chance to properly begin one. Daniel Bennett was 24, restless in the way of a young man who has been handed everything and trusted with nothing important, and his father's persistent interest in a broken-down couple's mountain shack struck him as beneath the family's dignity, though he lacked the will to say so outright. He was sent some weeks later ostensibly to survey timber, but in truth to scout what exactly the Callahans had built up there and why the old man seemed so unwilling to part with it. Daniel made a poor spy. He rode too close, too often, and Sonny announced his presence from half a mile off every single time, so that by the time he reached the grotto's mouth, Walter was already standing in the doorway with his arms folded, offering coffee with the calm courtesy of a man who has nothing to hide and everything to lose, which unsettled Daniel far more than open hostility would have. He accepted the coffee twice, refused it once out of some vague guilt he could not name, and reported back to his father only that the old couple seemed to be managing well enough, and that there did not appear to be anything worth the fuss, a report that visibly irritated Everett Bennett, who trusted his own instincts about mineral seams a good deal more than he trusted his son's judgment about anything at all. Unseen by either Bennett, an old hunter and sometime trapper named Otis Grady had taken to watching the ridge from a blind he kept in the high timber above the grotto, a habit he had fallen into 3 winters back after Walter had once dug him out of a snowbank, half frozen and half conscious, and had never once mentioned the debt aloud in all the years since. Otis was close to Walter's age, a widower himself, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a trapping accident decades past, and he moved through that country so quietly that even the deer seemed to forget he was there. He had seen Daniel Bennett's visits, had noted the pattern of them, and though he said nothing to the Callahans directly, Being a man who preferred watching to warning, he had begun keeping his rifle closer to hand and his horse a little better fed, in case the watching ever needed to become something else. Down in Miller's Crossing, a widow named Adeline Whitfield kept the general store's back counter and, more importantly, kept the threads of every conversation that passed through her door, weaving them into a rough tapestry of who owed whom, who feared whom, and who might need a quiet word passed along at the right moment. She had heard from 3 different mouths in as many weeks that Everett Bennett wanted the Callahan land badly enough to keep sending his son up that mountain, despite getting nothing for his trouble. And she filed the information away the way she filed everything, patiently, waiting for the moment it might matter. The first real snow came early that year, a full 10 days ahead of what the oldest men in town remembered as usual, and it fell soft and steady for 2 days before clearing to a hard, bright cold that split the ground in places and made the grotto's stone walls feel, for the first time that season, like exactly the mercy Walter had always believed they would be. Ruth moved the last of the root vegetables into the warm inner chamber, packing them in dry sand the way her own mother had taught her back in Ohio, and Walter finished stacking the season's wood with 3 full days to spare by his own careful count, though he added his customary margin regardless. They settled into the rhythm of a mountain winter, the small rituals that stretched the days into something bearable, Ruth's needle moving through worn cloth by lamplight, Walter mending a harness or sharpening tools, Sonny stretched before the hearth with one ear always angled toward the door, listening for something neither of the old people could hear yet, but he clearly could. It was during this quiet stretch that Ruth found herself thinking often of her own mother, gone now more than 30 years, who used to say that a house built with patience will always answer patience with shelter, and that the surest sign of trouble was a person who stopped listening to their home. Ruth had never fully understood the saying as a young woman. She understood it now, in the way the grotto's stone seemed to hum faintly during the coldest nights, a sound just beneath hearing that she had come to trust the way sailors trust a certain color in the evening sky. That trust was tested on the 2nd night of December, when Sonny would not settle. The old dog paced the length of the main chamber for nearly an hour, whining low in his throat, refusing food, pressing his nose again and again to the seam of the door, as though trying to read something written on the wind outside. Walter finally rose, wrapped himself against the cold, and stepped out to see for himself what had the animal so unsettled, and found the sky to the northwest gone a strange, bruised color he had seen only once before in his life, decades past, in the winter that had killed 11 head of his father's cattle in a single night. He came back inside without a word and began, methodically, moving every loose item toward the inner chamber, and Ruth, watching him work, asked only, "How bad?" And Walter answered, "Bad enough." And that was the whole of their conversation on the matter, because after 40 years of marriage, there was very little that needed more words than that. The storm arrived the following afternoon, not gradually, but all at once, as though the mountain itself had been holding its breath and finally released it in a single furious exhale. Snow came sideways, driven by wind that screamed through the grotto's outer chamber, even with the door barred and packed with cloth along every seam Walter could reach. The temperature dropped so fast and so far that the water bucket froze solid within an hour, and by nightfall the wind had reached a pitch that made conversation between Walter and Ruth, sitting no more than 4 feet apart, nearly impossible without raised voices, and raised voices were not something either of them cared to use even now. The 7 days that followed blurred together into a single long test of patience and rationed strength. On the first full day, Walter discovered that the outer chamber's chimney draft had reversed under the force of the wind, filling the main room with acrid smoke until Ruth's eyes streamed, and Sonny buried his nose beneath his own paws, and Walter spent 3 desperate hours packing wet cloth and ash into a makeshift baffle his father had once described building during a Missouri winter 40 years past. A memory Walter had never expected to need and was grateful in that moment to have kept. By the second day, the cold had found its way even into the warm inner chamber, the mountain's deep heat unable to fully counter a storm of such violence, and Ruth began rationing the lamp oil with the same careful count she gave to the preserves, allowing herself only enough light to check on the stores twice a day, moving through the darkness the rest of the time by memory and touch. Sonny would not leave Ruth's side during those hours, pressing his warm body against her legs whenever she sat still long enough. And more than once she found herself talking to the old dog the way she might once have talked to the boy who had lived only 8 days. Soft, useless words that were not really about anything except the simple fact of not being alone. On the 3rd day, the wind found a weakness in the outer door that Walter had not anticipated. A hairline gap where the oak had shrunk slightly from the frame during the dry autumn, and cold air began pouring through with a thin, high whistle that neither of them could block, no matter what they packed against it. Walter worked at the gap for hours with strips of hide and softened tallow, his old hands clumsy with cold despite his gloves, and twice he had to stop and warm his fingers against his own chest before he could continue, Ruth watching him with the particular stillness of a woman who has learned that offering to help a proud man with a task he insists on finishing himself only slows the work. By the 4th day, their store of readily available firewood in the main chamber had run low enough that Walter made the decision to brave the outer passage to the deep, dry recess where the bulk of the season's wood was kept. A journey of perhaps 30 feet that the howling wind and blinding snow turned into something closer to 30 miles. He tied a length of rope around his waist and anchored the other end to a stone Ruth braced with her own weight against the door, a precaution neither of them spoke about needing, but both understood without discussion, and he made the trip 4 times that day, each time returning half frozen and utterly spent, until Ruth finally told him, in a voice that brooked no argument despite its softness, that the wood they had was wood enough for 1 more night, and he would not go out there again until the wind eased even slightly. It was on the 5th night, the worst of the 7 by every measure, that Ruth found herself remembering her mother's words most clearly, sitting in near darkness with Sonny's head heavy across her lap, and Walter finally exhaustedly asleep beside the banked coals, listening to the mountain groan and hum around her in a language she had spent 11 winters learning to trust. The wind that night reached a pitch that made the very stones seem to vibrate, and for the first time in all their years in the grotto, Ruth allowed herself to wonder, quietly, whether patience alone would be enough this time. She did not wake Walter to share the thought. Instead, she sat with it, turning it over the way she once turned over a difficult piece of embroidery, looking for the thread that would resolve the pattern. And somewhere in that long, dark hour, she remembered, not her mother's words this time, but a simpler thing. The sensation of Walter's hand against warm stone, the autumn he had first found the seam, and the way he had described the mountain as a good neighbor rather than a resource to be taken. She realized, sitting there, that they had survived every trial the mountain had offered, not by fighting it, but by listening to it, and that the storm outside, however violent, was not an enemy so much as a conversation the mountain was having with itself, one they had simply chosen to shelter within rather than resist. It was not a solution to anything practical. It changed nothing about the cold or the wind or the dwindling wood, but it settled something in her chest that had been shaking loose since the third day, and she found she could finally close her own eyes, Sonny's steady breathing beneath her hand, and rest. Otis Grady had not abandoned his post through any of it, though the storm had driven even a man of his hardiness to shelter in a hollow beneath an overhang a half-mile from his usual blind, close enough to keep half an eye on the grotto's chimney through gaps in the driving snow whenever the wind allowed him a moment's visibility. On the fourth day, when he saw no smoke rising for nearly 6 hours during the worst of the wind's reversal problem, his old heart had clenched with a fear he recognized from wartime, the fear of arriving too late to matter, and he had begun making his way toward the grotto through conditions that would have killed a less experienced man, only to see, an hour into his difficult crossing, a thin gray thread of smoke finally rise again against the white chaos, and he had stopped where he stood and simply watched it for a long moment, feeling something in his own chest ease loose the way Ruth's had eased inside the grotto, though he could not have known that at the time. He did not attempt to reach the door that night, judging correctly that his presence would help no one and might well cost him his own life for nothing. But he stayed close through the 5th and 6th days, watching that thread of smoke the way another man might watch a lighthouse. And it was Otis, and Otis alone, who witnessed what the Callahans' method of building had truly withstood, a fact that would matter a great deal once the storm finally broke. The 7th day arrived not with sunshine, but with a gradual, grudging stillness, the wind dying by slow degrees through the morning hours, until by early afternoon Walter was able to force the swollen oak door open against a solid wall of drifted snow, and stand blinking in a silence so complete after 7 days of screaming wind that it felt, for a moment, like a kind of deafness. The mountain beyond the grotto's mouth had been utterly transformed. Drifts piled higher than a man's head in places, familiar landmarks buried or reshaped beyond easy recognition. But the grotto itself stood exactly as it had, stone walls unmoved, chimney intact, the small fire inside still holding its steady warmth against a world gone white and silent. Sonny pushed past Walter's legs the moment the door opened wide enough, plunging into the snow with the sudden joy of an animal released from a week's confinement. And it was the dog's exuberant barking, more than anything else, that alerted Otis Grady to the fact that the door had finally opened, prompting the old hunter to make his own difficult way down through the drifts, to see with his own eyes what he had, until that moment, only been able to infer from a distant thread of smoke. What Otis found when he finally reached the grotto's mouth, and Walter waved him inside out of the bitter residual cold, left him quieter than Walter had ever seen him. The old hunter walked the length of the main chamber slowly, running his remaining fingers along the stone walls, noting the chimney's clever baffle system Walter had improvised, the careful placement of the inner warm chamber, where the last of the winter stores still sat dry and untouched by frost. And he said, finally, in the gruff voice of a man unused to admitting wonder, "I have wintered in this country 60 years, Walter Callahan, and I have never seen a storm like that 7 days, and I have never seen a shelter come through it like this one did neither." Ruth, pouring coffee with hands that had not quite stopped trembling from the accumulated strain of the week, said only, "The mountain looked after us." And Otis, who was not a man given to argument, simply nodded, because he had watched that thread of smoke rise steady against 7 days of the worst weather he had ever witnessed, and he understood that whatever he had just seen was not luck. Otis rode down to Miller's Crossing 3 days later, once the roads had been broken open enough for passage, and he did not go quietly about what he had witnessed the way he usually kept his own counsel. He went first to Adeline Whitfield's store, because he understood, in the way of men who have lived long enough to learn a few practical truths, that whatever he told her would reach every corner of that town within a single day. And he told her plainly what he had seen, the smoke rising steady through 7 days that had, elsewhere in the county, torn roofs from barns and driven 3 ranch families out of homes gone suddenly uninhabitable. Adeline listened with the particular stillness she reserved for information she recognized as valuable, and by that same evening the story had indeed traveled the length of the town, gathering small embellishments as it went, the way stories always did, until by the following week it had become, in the mouths of some, something bordering on legend, though the essential truth of it, a shelter built into living stone that had outlasted the worst storm in a generation, remained solid at its center. Everett Bennett heard the story from 3 different sources within 2 days, and where the tale filled most listeners with a kind of wondering respect, it filled Bennett instead with a colder and more immediate calculation, because a shelter that could withstand such weather, built above ground he already believed held rich mineral seams, was suddenly worth a great deal more to him than it had been a fortnight before, and he sent his son back up the mountain a 3rd time with an offer nearly double the last, framed once more as generosity toward 2 old folks who had, after all, just survived quite a fright. Daniel Bennett arrived at the grotto on a cold, clear morning in the 2nd week of December, and this time he found Otis Grady sitting on an overturned barrel just inside the grotto's mouth, whittling, nothing in particular, with a slow, patient knife, a presence that unsettled the young man far more than his father's offer emboldened him. Walter received the new offer with the same unhurried courtesy as always, and this time it was Walter himself who spoke, standing in his own doorway with Ruth just behind his shoulder and Sonny sitting alert at his feet.
"You can tell your father," Walter said, "that this mountain is not for sale, and that a man who sends his boy up here 3 times chasing something he wants but will not say plainly ought to consider whether that's the kind of neighbor he wishes to be remembered as. Daniel had no ready answer for that, and something in Walter's plain, unhurried delivery seemed to land on him in a way his father's careful instructions never had. Because he rode back down the mountain that day, turning the words over in his mind, and turning over, too, the memory of the coffee he had twice accepted from an old couple who had never once treated him as anything other than a young man doing a difficult job. And by the time he reached his father's ranch, he had begun to feel, for the first time, a genuine discomfort about the whole business that no amount of family loyalty could entirely smooth away. What finally ended Everett Bennett's ambitions toward the Callahan land had little to do with confrontation and everything to do with paper, the quiet machinery of ownership and record that moved far from the mountain entirely. Ruth's late brother, it turned out, had years before filed a modest claim on the acreage surrounding the old homestead, a legal formality undertaken during better days and largely forgotten by everyone except a distant cousin who still kept the family's affairs in careful order down in the territorial land office, a woman named Constance, whom Ruth had not spoken with in over a decade. It was Adeline Whitfield, gathering threads as she always did, who thought to write to that land office on the Callahans' behalf, mentioning, almost in passing, the recent trouble with Bennett's persistent offers. And Constance, upon reviewing the old filing, discovered that the claim's boundaries, properly surveyed, extended considerably further up the ridge than anyone in Miller's Crossing had ever assumed, encompassing not only the grotto itself, but a fair portion of the very ground Bennett had hoped to develop. The legal correspondence that followed took the better part of 2 months and involved no drama whatsoever beyond the patient exchange of official letters, but its conclusion was as decisive as any confrontation could have been. Everett Bennett received notice, delivered without ceremony by the Territorial Land Office, that his mineral ambitions toward that ridge would require negotiating not with 2 elderly homesteaders alone, but with an established and properly documented claim that predated his own interest by decades, and the cost and difficulty of untangling that reality proved, in the end, more than even Bennett's considerable patience could justify. He let the matter drop that spring, quietly, without ever admitting defeat aloud, and Daniel, for his part, found himself relieved in a way he did not examine too closely, and took to riding up that mountain occasionally in the following seasons, not to scout or spy, but simply to help Walter with the wood, a habit neither man commented on directly. By the time the last snow melted off the ridge that spring, the story of the elderly couple and their 7-day survival had settled into something like permanent local legend, told and retold at the mercantile counter and around supper tables throughout the county, and more than one struggling family, facing the prospect of rebuilding after hard times, came quietly up the mountain that year to see the grotto for themselves and ask Walter's advice on working with stone rather than always against it. Walter, never a man for lengthy speeches, showed them what there was to show and answered what questions he could, and slowly, over the following years, a scattering of similar shelters began appearing throughout that high country, each one different, each one shaped by whatever particular stone and slope its builders had been given, but each one carrying some small echo of the lesson Walter's father had first planted in him decades before in Missouri. Ruth kept her garden that following summer with the same careful patience as always, and Sonny, grown a little grayer but no less devoted, still slept each night before the hearth with one ear turned toward the door, though the sound he listened for now was simply the ordinary settling of an ordinary house, the 7-day blizzard having passed into memory the way all storms eventually do, leaving behind not fear, but a kind of hard-won stillness. On clear autumn evenings, when the light went gold and long across the valley, Walter would sometimes stand outside the grotto's mouth with his hand pressed flat against the warm stone, the way he had that very first day. And Ruth, watching from the doorway, understood without needing to ask exactly what he was thinking, because she was thinking it too. The mountain had never once broken its promise. And if you have made it this far into their story, tucked in wherever you are watching from tonight, we hope you carry a little of that same quiet patience into whatever storm you happen to be weathering. And we will see you again very soon for the next one.